Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 378. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to pick up where we left off in the last podcast. We've been talking about Jewish history, and this is such it's a topic that is very, very deep. There's a lot of stuff that I am not going to get to. The Jewish history is, they'll tell you that the Jewish history is nearly 6,000 years old. It's at least, the Jewish calendar, I think, is 3,700 years old. It is a very rich history, and it's the study of the Jewish people is a very interesting study, to say the least. Like I said, we started this talking about the time period of the Jewish kings, and like I was explaining in the last podcast, you have the period of the Jewish kings, but there is a period of Jewish history where there were no kings, where it was just them and God, and you had leaders like Joshua, like Moses leading the people. Then you had the period of the judges. And then you get into the period of the kings, starting with Saul and then David. Again, we talked about this in the last podcast, that David is told that the line of his descendants will sit on this throne that David establishes forever, is what the prophet Nehemiah tells David. He's also told by that Samuel that his rule, or his line and his kingdom will come to no end, and someone from his line will sit on the throne forever. So they go from the period of not having a king, and then to the period of the judges, and then you have the period of the kings, and then we picked up talking about the end of the Jewish kings. After Solomon, the kingdoms break up into two different kingdoms: Kingdom of Israel to the north, Kingdom of Judah to the south, and then the 10 kingdoms to the north are scattered and destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and then the Neo-Babylonian Empire destroys the southern kingdom, takes them back into exile. And we've been talking about what happens after that exile, when the Persians conquer Babylon and allow those Jews to return. And then they're in a period, and this is when we get into Daniel's dream, or Nebuchadnezzar's dream, who's the king of Babylon, and Daniel's interpretation of his dream about the 4 kingdoms that the Jews are going to live under after the Babylonian captivity. They're no longer living under Jewish kings. Now they're going to be living under Gentile kings, starting with the kings of Babylon, then the kings of Persia, the Greek kings, the Roman kings, onto today. That there was no longer a Jewish kingdom. And so we asked the question, what was God talking about? What were the prophets talking about when they prophesied to David that his kingdom was going to last forever? Someone from his line is going to sit on the throne forever. And of course, that brings us to Jesus Christ, and Jesus being a descendant of David, Jesus presenting himself as king. We talked a little bit about that in the last podcast, but we were asking the question when we ended the last podcast: are the Jews that are in Israel today, are they the same Jews from the Bible? I love that question, because I think that it is such a interesting question. A lot of people are asking that question today. A lot of people are saying, no, the Jews that are in Israel today are not the Jews from the Bible. And Like I'm just telling you, I mean, Jewish history goes back thousands of years. Which period of time are you talking about when you say that the Jews of today are not the Jews from the Bible? The Jews from the Bible before, you know, the slavery in Egypt, the Jews from the Bible during the slavery in Egypt, the Jews from the Bible from the Exodus, the Jews from the Bible in the wilderness, the Jews that went into the land of milk and honey when Joshua takes them over the Jordan into that land. Those Jews are very different from the Jews that were in the wilderness. As a matter of fact, that's why they were in the wilderness for 40 years. If you read the Torah and Deuteronomy and Exodus, that God explains to Moses that the reason that he was going to take them through the wilderness before he took them into the land is because he wanted a lot of them to die off. That's what he says. That he wanted that a lot of them had the mentality from Egypt still, and he didn't want to take that mentality into the land. So that's why he wanted to take basically, the young people, the people who he had conditioned and who knew him from the wilderness, knew the God of their forefathers from the wilderness. He wanted to take those people into the land, but he didn't want people with the mindset of Egypt going into the new land. So that's why they were in the, so those people were the people with the mindset of Egypt that died in the wilderness. Those people would have been very different from the people that went into the land and conquered the Canaanites and took the land in the very first Zionist movement. Those people would have been different. The people, so the time period that we're talking about after the Babylonian captivity, when these people go back from, led by Zerubbabel, they go back to the land after the first temple had been destroyed. They go back to the land. They try to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. Not everybody wanted to come back. You got to think about that. Think about that second Zionist movement. Like I told you, there's been 3 Zionist movements. There've been the Zionist movement after the Exodus, when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they go and then Joshua takes them over the Jordan and to conquer the Canaanites and conquer the land for the first time. That's the first Zionist movement. The second Zionist movement is after the Babylonian exile, when the Persians take over Babylon and Cyrus gives the edict for the Jews to go back to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. That's the second Zionist movement. And then the third Zionist movement started in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. And that is the people in Israel that are going back to Israel today. And not all of them are back. More Jews live outside of Israel today than live inside of Israel. There's about 15 million Jews on the planet. About 8 million live outside of Israel, majority in the United States, but all over. And you got about 7 million Jews that live in Israel. So this was what would happen after the Babylonian exile, when Zerubbabel goes back to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city after the exile. Only a fraction of Jews went back. Not all of them went back. And now that the Persians were in charge, I mean, these people had lives. Many of them were, very successful throughout the Persian Empire. Why would you go back to this place that is in ruins? Because the Babylonians left it in ruins. The temple's destroyed. It's going to be work rebuilding the city, rebuilding the temple. So it was an effort for Zerubbabel to encourage people that we got to go back. And many of them didn't want to go back. They did go back. It's kind of the same thing. There's so many parallels between the second Zionist movement after the Babylonian exile and the third Zionist movement. There are a lot of parallels. But I was thinking about what I can do to make people understand this period of time between the Babylonian the end of the Babylonian exile and the decree of Cyrus, 539 BCE is when the Persians conquer Babylon, 539 BCE. And that period of time when Zerubbabel and that fraction of Jews leave Babylon to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple, the period of time when that decree comes out from Cyrus and the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, which leads to the birth of Christ, this is about 500 years. This is about 500 years between the decree of Cyrus and the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, when the Romans take over and you're leading up to the birth of Christ. About 500 years, and this is the most interesting 500 years, in my point of view, out of the thousands of years of Jewish history. As I said, there's thousands of years of Jewish history, but these 500 years between the Edict of Cyrus and the end of the Hasmonean dynasty comes after the Maccabean revolt, and this leads up to the birth of Christ. So let's just say the birth of Christ. The Edict of Cyrus to the birth of Christ is about 500 years, and this is a very interesting period in Jewish history. Now, asking the question again, are the Jews of today that are in Israel today, are they the same Jews from the Bible? And what I'm going to tell you is that you could have taken a Jew from the kingdom of Israel that David was the king of, or even Saul was the king of, 500 years before this period of time that we're talking about, between the Edict of Cyrus and the birth of Christ. And you could have taken someone from the time of David and in a time machine and brought them to that period of time, to those 500 years it's called the Second Temple period, or the Zerubbabel Temple period. That you could have taken someone from the Solomon Temple period and in a time machine moved them to this 500-year period, and they would not have recognized the Jews of that period. That's how different they were. And they did have some similarities. They had some similar customs, but particularly when the Greeks take over and these Jews become Hellenistic, they wouldn't have, so you have all of these different Jews, different types of Jews, over thousands of years. So asking the question of, are the Jews today the Jews from the Bible? Tell me which Jews you're talking about, first of all. Same thing here in the United States, though. Even people that are not Jews, this is just the way people are. You could take a colonial Englishman in the United States, and when the United States becomes a country, and someone from the early 19th century, and in a time machine bring them to today, they wouldn't recognize America. Americans have certainly changed in the last 200 years. So there are some similarities. And the thing is not all Jews are the same. Jews are people. They're people just like all of us. That's what I was getting to. I was trying to think about how I could make you guys understand what I'm talking about. And I came up with this example to kind of explain. And it's not, I know that it's going to be completely a accurate analogy, but I'm going to try to make it work. The Twin Towers. The Twin Towers are kind of like Solomon's temple. And Solomon's temple was erected by Solomon. You can read about what happens, and that's where he brought in the Ark of the Covenant, and this was the dwelling place of God, and it's part of the Jewish culture for years and years. But then Solomon's temple is destroyed. The World Trade Center was destroyed, and now you have the Freedom Tower. The Freedom Tower was replaced the World Trade Center. It's in the same spot, and the Freedom Tower was built to replace the World Trade Center. Just like Zerubbabel's temple was built to replace Solomon's temple. And the Second Temple era is very different. Like people like Zerubbabel, who was born in exile, born in Babylon, never got to see Jerusalem, never saw Solomon's temple. He doesn't have any concept of what life was like during the period of Solomon's temple, during the period of the Jewish kings. He and many others had no idea. And that's the same thing with 9/11 and the Twin Towers and the Freedom Tower. And I think about that, for people in my generation, Gen Xers who grew up in the world of the Twin Towers, you think about all of the movies, all the television shows from the 80s, but you know how many, these are iconic buildings. These were iconic buildings to tell the story of a generation. And seriously, you can go and look at some of these YouTube videos that show all of the movies that have the Twin Towers in them, all the TV shows that have, these are cultural icons, the Twin Towers. They're no more. They're no more. Now you have the Freedom Tower, and you have a era and a generation, a new generation, the Gen Xers, the Gen Zers, that don't have any concept of these two buildings. They don't know. It was a different era. It was a different people. And there's a new generation coming about that is coming about in the era, the Freedom Tower era, and they don't have any concept of what the era of the Twin Towers was. That's the way it was for the Jewish people during the Second Temple period. During the Second Temple period, that many Jews had no concept. They were very different from the period of the kings. And that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about Daniel interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar's dream is about 5 kingdoms and then a 6th kingdom that's not cut from hands, that comes out, that starts as a rock and then smashes into the feet and then grows into a mountain and never ends. A kingdom, and Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that's a kingdom that's never going to end. So the Jews, they go from a period where they were their own kings. They had autonomy. They were completely sovereign under the Jewish kings. And then they split, and then you have the kings to the north, the kings to the south, but they were kings. But then after the Babylonian captivity, they're going to be under Gentile kings. They're going to be ruled by Gentile kings. And we were explaining in the last podcast, and I showed you in the Gospels where the Jews, on the night that Jesus is arrested, that next morning they bring him to Pilate, who is the Roman governor. The king at that time was Tiberius, the Emperor Tiberius, but Pilate was the governor, and the Jews bring Jesus to him, and they tell him that, we want you to try him. And Pilate says, what has he done? Why don't you just try him? And they tell Pilate, we don't have any authority. We don't have any authority to kill him, because they wanted to kill him. During the period of the Jewish kings, the Jewish kings could give life and death to whoever, because they were in charge. They had the authority because they were under the Jewish monarchies and Jewish kingdoms. But after the Babylonian exile, the Jews are not living under kingdom anymore, and they have the short 100-year period of the Hasmonean dynasty after the Maccabean revolt, where you have that small period of autonomy, but then they were under the Romans rule. So basically, they go from the period of the Jewish kings to being under the rule of the Gentile kings, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, but then the Persian Cyrus the Great frees them, and they go back. They have a relationship with the Greeks, which we're going to get into, and then the Romans we talked about. The 500-year period that I mentioned that we're focused on is the period after the decree of Cyrus and to the birth of Christ. It's a 500-year period. That period starts off in the Persian Empire and lasts a little bit over a century, but the majority of that 500-year period is in the Greek Empire. And we're going to get into that and talk about that as we continue this series of podcasts. And I want to get through this series of podcasts. I don't know how long I'm going to take it, but I like to do politics. I like to talk about politics. This is an election year. So I want to finish this series of podcasts and get back into some politics and things that are going on in our country. So I'm going to try to wrap this up. It may take me till, springtime. I may be in doing this series of podcasts, through next month as well. But I want to get through this and I want to get back into doing some politics. But Malachi, the prophet Malachi, is the last Jewish prophet in the Tanakh and in the Christian Bible. He is the last Jewish prophet in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, the Jewish canon closes after Malachi. And this isn't very important because we were talking about these periods in Jewish history from the slavery in Egypt to the Exodus, from the Exodus to the wilderness, from the wilderness into the promised land, from the promised land into the period of the judges, from, the judges to the kings, from the kings to the period where they're under the rule of the Gentile kings. But in those periods of times, starting with the prophet Samuel, there has always been a Jewish prophet. And that's what the Nevi'im, when we were talking about the Tanakh and the prophets, that Daniel's not included with the prophets, but you can see all the prophets here. You have Samuel, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all the way to Malachi. Malachi is the last prophet. The prophet Malachi is when the canon closes. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, these are all prophets that are prophets in that 500-year period from the decree of Cyrus to the birth of Christ. But the majority of those 500 years, there's no prophet. 500 years between the decree of Cyrus, the end of the Babylonian exile, and the birth of Christ. After Malachi, there's no prophet. And so that's another very interesting thing about this period of time, this 500 years between the Babylonian exile and the birth of Christ, is that for the majority of that time, there's no prophets. That the people of Israel, the Jewish people, are not hearing from God. This is why you have to understand. It's because the canon closes after Malachi, and this is when you start seeing the Talmud develop. This is why you need the Talmud, because you're not hearing from God anymore. And then what you're going to start understanding is you're going to see as the Talmud is developing, the New Testament is developing alongside the Talmud. Sorry, that's the truth. Now they can say they have this oral history that from the Talmud dates back to, but we notice the Talmud being in print the first time in between the 3rd and 5th century AD. So the Talmud is evolving at the same time the New Testament is evolving. The reason that you need the Talmud is because you don't have any more prophets. You don't have any more prophets speaking from God to the people, which is something significant about this 500-year period. And Malachi is the last prophet. And we're going to probably get into Malachi because you got to understand Malachi. You're going to get into some Malachi in the next podcast, because you're asking the question, are the Jews today the same Jews from the Bible? These Jews, and you have to know who these Jews were. You have to know who they were. Now, a lot of people, when they're talking about that question about are the Jews today the same Jews of the Bible, they're talking about genetics and the ancestry. And that's what we left off in the last podcast, talking about the Ashkenazi Jews, because this is only a question about Ashkenazi Jews. Nobody is saying all of these things about questioning the Jews in Israel being the Jews from the Bible, about Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews or even the Beta Israel Jews. This is only a question about European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews. And that's where we left off in the last podcast, talking about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Khazar theory. If you remember, we talked about this in the last podcast. This is the the quote from John Philby, the MI6 officer that befriended and became an advisor to the House of Saud, and then he's exiled from Saudi Arabia, and then he is exiled into Lebanon, where he writes this memoir. And he had been trying to work out a deal to move the Palestinians. We're talking about the current day Zionist movement and what's going on in that region today. But Philby was trying to work out a plan to move the Palestinians, the people that were already living there, to Saudi Arabia, was the plan. And they were never able to make that work out. But Philby writes in his memoir while he was in Lebanon, and we read this in the last podcast, that the true basis of Arab hostility to Jewish immigration into Palestine is xenophobia, the instinctive perception that a vast majority of Central and Eastern European Jews seeking admissions are not Semites at all. Genetically, their ancestry, they're not Semites at all. Whatever the political repercussions of their settlement may be, their advent is regarded as a menace to the Semitic cultures of Arabia. The European Jew of today, with his secular outlook, is regarded as an unwelcome intruder within the gates of Arabia. So, what Philby is saying here is that the Arab people in that region, the neighbors, they don't have a problem with the Beta Israel Jews or the Mizrahi Jews or the Sephardic Jews. Their only problem, according to Jack Philby, is with the Eastern European Jew, the Ashkenazi Jew. So when people are talking about anti-Semitism and all this stuff, that it's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Ashkenazi. It's anti-European Jew is what it is. That's what you see going on. And a lot of this comes from the Khazar narrative, the Khazar theory, which we're going to get back into here in a moment. But this part of Philby's quote in his memoir, with his secular outlook, I thought that was very interesting. The Eastern European Jew of today with his secular outlook. That right there is very different from the Jews of David's time, from the Jews in the time of Solomon. I mean, for most of Jewish history, the Jews haven't been secular. They're secular today. So that's one thing that's different. I found this chart. This is from 2017. It's 9 years old, but we're going to go with it because I doubt that it's changed much. But this is the religious breakdown of Jews in Israel, breakdown of religious Jews by their religion. You can see that 56%, almost 57% are secular, either totally secular or secular traditional, that the majority of Israel today is secular. It's that today, Israel is not only not a kingdom, it's secular. And that's another issue that Philby points out. Not only are these Eastern European Jews, not only do they not have ancestry that connects them to this land, they're also secular, and we have a problem with that. And so this all is the Khazar theory. This all goes back to the Khazar theory. We're going to get back into the video that we ended last podcast with. But this was a post, and we read this in the last podcast, a post that I saw on X that says, Israelis are not Israelites. Khazars are not Semites. Ashkenazis are not Hebrews. That it points out Ashkenazis, that this is an issue about the Eastern European Jew. This is an issue about the Ashkenazi. This is not an issue about Sephardic Jews. It's not an issue about Beta Israel Jews. This is not an issue about the Limba Jews in sub-Saharan Africa. This is not an issue about the B'nai Menashe Jews in India. This is an issue specifically about the Eastern European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews. Israelis are not Israelites. Khazars are not Semites. Ashkenazis are not Hebrews. The Talmud, not the Torah. Yiddish is not Aramaic. The satanic bankers who created the country of Israel in 1948 are imposters. They are not real Jews. And this is the opinion and that many people have. And it all goes back to this Khazar theory, which we played this clip in the last podcast, started talking about the Khazar theory. We're going to play more of this.
According to various Jewish, Muslim, and Christian sources, in the 9th century, King Bulan decided to become Jewish. Some accounts claim that the king weighed the 3 Abrahamic faiths against each other and ultimately chose Judaism. Why Judaism? There's no way to know King Bulan's true motivation. Maybe it was a true spiritual calling. Or maybe it was a savvy political move to avoid angering the Christian and Muslim superpowers on his borders, while still remaining neutral in their never-ending religious conflicts. Or maybe just like Hanukkah. Now, if the king started practicing Judaism, it's reasonable to assume others followed his lead. But just how many? We don't know. Some sources claim that over the centuries, Khazaria became an overwhelmingly Jewish kingdom. But many historians are skeptical.
They're digging in the wrong place.
It's a widely debated topic that's led to some fascinating questions, like this design, found engraved on a metal disc at a Khazar site. Is it a Star of David or a shamanistic sun disk?
So I like this part. So he's saying that this was found in a Khazar site, and is it a Star of David or is it a shamanistic sun disk? Both are the same. There is the Star of David has no affiliation with the King David. Star of David is an occult symbol. It was the seal of Solomon, the 6-point star. The 6-point star has been used in occult circles for millennia. So asking the question, is it a shamanistic sun disk or the Star of David? The answer is yes. I thought that was cute.
Widely debated topic that's led to some fascinating questions, like this design, found engraved on a metal disc at a Khazar site. Is it a Star of David or a shamanistic sun disk? And even if Judaism became widespread among Khazarians, there's no way to know how many of those Jews actually came from Khazar families that converted, and how many came from ethnically Jewish families who migrated to the area. Remember, Khazar was a melting pot of tolerance where Jewish refugees were welcome, all the more so after the king himself started practicing Judaism.
It's true.
I think it's important to emphasize that in Judaism, converts are treated exactly the same as people who are born Jewish.
That's true, and I stopped it in the last podcast and pointed out that that's true, that that Jewish converts, this is in the Bible, that there were several converts, and so what's her name that helped them spy on Canaan before they took the land. They were Canaanites. They converted. They have been Jewish converts, and in the Bible, Jewish converts are treated just like Jews. So that's why I say that this doesn't matter. But I want to do this because I think this is an important topic.
All the more so after the king himself started practicing Judaism. I think it's important to emphasize that in Judaism, converts are treated exactly the same as people who are born Jewish. So, what's the difference? Well, here's where things get a bit more controversial. According to the Khazar theory, the kingdom was filled with practicing Jews who were descended from Turkic converts, not from ancient Judeans. And when the kingdom was conquered, all of these Turkic Jews flooded the neighboring regions of Eastern Europe, becoming the ancestors of modern Ashkenazi Jews. That would mean that Ashkenazi Jews, the majority of today's Jews, have no ancestral connection to ancient Israel, no biological link to Abraham, Moses, or the people of the Bible. Instead, they're descendants of medieval Turkic nomads who adopted Judaism. This obsession with Jewish biology or Jewish lineage is what makes this a dangerous conspiracy theory. It's been weaponized to...
It's not a conspiracy theory. He uses that term conspiracy theory quite a bit. It's a theory, but it's not a conspiracy theory, and I just wanted to point that out.
Or Jewish lineage is what makes this a dangerous conspiracy theory. It's been weaponized to deny Jewish identity, delegitimize Israel, and fuel anti-Semitic conspiracies that have led to real-world violence. Here's how the Khazar theory gets used today.
Much of European Jews and much of the European Jewish colonizers of Palestine are all descendants of medieval converts to Judaism.
And then there's the 2019 Jersey City shooter who took people's lives in a Jewish supermarket.
The kosher grocery store with mostly Jewish customers and workers was not a random target.
He referred to his Jewish victims as Khazars. There are countless memes like this one, calling Jews Jew-ish instead of Jewish. Even Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas promoted the theory during a 2018 speech.
Yeah, and I think that this is so interesting because as we go into this and start talking about this 500-year period between the Edict of Cyrus and the birth of Christ and what was going on as the Jews went back from Babylon and tried to rebuild the city, there were people that were already living there, that had been living there for 70 years, had built their lives there. Some of them were Jewish. Some of them, because when the exile happened and Nebuchadnezzar takes these exiles back into Babylon, he only took the best of the best. He only took 7,000 to 10,000 Jews back into Babylon. So many of the Jews stayed in the destroyed city, built lives in the ruins, and they started marrying and intermarrying other people who had come in the northern kingdoms from the after the Assyrians brought all these people in. This is where the Samaritans come from, that they were people that were half Jews and half Gentiles. And that's something that these people faced when they came back from Babylon. And they were basically saying, no, that these people are not welcome. They don't have any connection because they're not 100% Jewish. And I find this very interesting. Like I said, the Zionist movement, that after the Babylonian exile and the Zionist movement of today, there are many parallels.
And then there's the 2019 Jersey City shooter who took people's lives in a Jewish supermarket.
The kosher grocery store with mostly Jewish customers and workers was not a random target.
He referred to his Jewish victims as Khazars. There are countless memes like this one, calling Jews Jew-ish instead of Jewish. Even Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas promoted the theory during a 2018 speech, claiming that Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Khazars, not the biblical Israelites. Someone should remind Abbas that most Jews in Israel aren't even Ashkenazi.
All right, so this is a very important...
Millions of Israelis are Mizrahi.
This is a very important point that I want to point to, this graph. Because there's another graph that he talks about in this video. Where is that at? It's over here. Where's that other graph? I want to show you. All right, this one. So this graph he shows earlier, and it shows that there's 15 million plus Jews worldwide. Of the 15 million plus Jews worldwide, 72% are Ashkenazi Jews. So that's nearly 3/4 of all the Jews on the planet are Ashkenazi Jews. You have other here. You have the Mizrahi. You have the Sephardic. I guess the other would be the Beta Israel, the Bnei Menashe, the Limba in Africa. But almost 3/4 of all the Jews on the planet are Ashkenazi Jews. But in Israel, this is what this graph says. In Israel, 45%, the majority of the Jews that live in Israel, and remember what I told you, of the 15 million Jews worldwide, only 7 million live in Israel. 8 million live outside of Israel. So within Israel, the majority of the Jews that live within Israel are Sephardic and Mizrahi, which globally that the majority of the Jews are Ashkenazi, but in Israel, the majority of the Jews are Mizrahi and Sephardic. And I just think that that's very interesting because all of this is about Ashkenazi Jews and the Zionist movement was started by the Ashkenazi Jews. And we just read from Jack Philby saying that the Arabs, they have the problem with the Ashkenazi Jews. They don't have a problem with the Mizrahi and Sephardic. It's the Ashkenazi Jews that they have a problem with. And the majority of the Jews that live in Israel who have decided to return to Israel are Mizrahi and Sephardic, and Ashkenazis make up 32%, just 1/3 of the Jews in Israel. So they make up 1/3 of the Jews in Israel. They make up 3/4 of the Jews worldwide. So the majority of the Jews worldwide are Ashkenazis who live in the United States, who live in other places. The majority of those people are Ashkenazi. But in Israel, the majority are Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. And I just think that's important because we're asking the question, are the Jews in Israel today the Jews from the Bible? And even if you say that the Ashkenazis are not the Jews from the Bible because they don't have a genetic connection in their ancestry, even if you go with this Khazar theory and say that that's true, what about the Sephardic? What about the Mizrahi? You're going to tell me that they don't have any ancestry and genetic connection as well? So that's why you have a problem. And this is why I say that it doesn't matter and it's impossible to know. The majority of people who live in Israel are Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews.
Israelis are Mizrahi Jews who fled to Israel from Middle East and North African countries where they had lived for thousands of years. Someone should remind Abbas that most Jews in Israel aren't even Ashkenazi. Millions of Israelis are Mizrahi Jews who fled to Israel from Middle East and North African countries where they had lived for thousands of years. But facts aren't really the point here. The Khazar theory has become a weapon. It's a tool to erase Jewish peoplehood and deny Jews their ancestral connection to the land of Israel. It reduces an entire people, centuries of persecution, tradition, and heritage, to nothing more than foreign imposters.
All right, so this is a great video. He goes into some of the genetic evidence that is against this theory of the Khazars. I mean, I don't want to get into all that. You can look it up yourself, but I mean, this is a huge debate. This is that same chart that they mentioned in the video that shows that Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews make up the majority of the Jews in Israel. But this idea of getting Jews to come back to Israel, this was the same issue that Zerubbabel had after the Babylonian exile when he brings a fraction of the Jews back to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. It was a mission of his, and then Ezra and then Nehemiah as well, to get people to come back, from their comfortable lives in the Persian Empire now that they had been exiled and they'd built their lives in Babylon, and they wanted to get them to come back. This is another parallel between the Zionist movement, the second Zionist movement that happened after the Babylonian exile, and the Zionist movement of today, to get the people to come back. And that's why you have things like Birthright Israel. If you're not familiar with Birthright Israel, this is this organization that pays all expense paid trips for Jews to come back to Israel, to basically fall in love with Israel and to move back to Israel. Because, like I said, there's 15 million Jews on the planet. 7 million live in Israel. The majority of the Jews that live in Israel are not Ashkenazi. They're Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. And they need people to move back so they can have the numbers that they need, especially with the conflict going on. So they're really trying to encourage the people to come back. And that's what this Birthright Israel organization is about. I have a clip about Birthright Israel, but the point I'm trying to make is this is the same thing that was going on in this 500-year period between the Edict of Cyrus and the birth of Christ, where Jews trying to encourage all these other Jews to come back, come back, come back. This is what Zionism is about. Come back. Take a listen to this clip about Birthright.
A 10-day trip to Israel with flights, food, and a ton of Instagrammable moments. All for free? You may have heard of Birthright Israel, the all-expense-paid adventure to the Holy Land. Seems too good to be true, right? There has to be a catch. But there isn't one. You're not going to be roped into long, boring religious seminars or be told what to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, there is a goal. I mean, this isn't Oprah. The organization behind the trips does have donors who want a return on their investment. So what is the goal of Birthright Israel? In the 1990s, polls in America and throughout the West confirmed what most Jews could see for themselves. Many young Jews were drifting away from Jewish life. They weren't excited about being Jewish or building Jewish lives. Jewish leaders called this the continuity crisis. While pondering this crisis,
this is the exact same. This exact same thing happened. What she just said, that and this namely started happening when the Greeks come to power, and during the Hellenistic period, that many Jews, that's what the Maccabean revolt was about. When we start getting into the Maccabean revolt, and I explain it to you, you gotta understand that the Maccabees, the very first people they target were other Jews. That's the very first people they target. Before they went to war with any of the Greeks, they targeted other Jews who had fallen off.
They weren't excited about being Jewish or building Jewish lives. Jewish leaders called this the continuity crisis. While pondering this crisis, these leaders noticed that when they traveled with their families to Israel, their kids seemed far more excited about being Jewish. Recognizing how their own kids connected to their heritage in Israel but yawned in synagogue, they wondered if visiting Israel would have the same positive impact on others. That got them thinking, could they make trips to Israel more accessible? In the 90s, most young Jews had never visited Israel, especially not those living in North America, where the 11-hour-plus plane ride didn't come cheap. The polling at the time predicted that barely 1 in 5 American Jews would visit Israel at any point during their lifetimes. 2 philanthropists took this all very seriously and brought other thinkers and leaders together to wrestle with the issue. They came up with kind of a crazy proposal. Could we give every young Jew born outside of Israel the gift of a trip to Israel? That premise would eventually become the most unprecedented, experimental, and ambitious educational project Judaism had ever seen. But in those early days, there was a lot to sort out. How long should the trip be? Should it be free for everyone? Should they? All right,
so that's Birthright Israel. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. But this is exactly the same thing that was going on after the Edict of Cyrus, when Zerubbabel brought the initial first fraction of the Jews back from Babylon to build the city and to build the temple, and tried to then, after they started showing success and they were able to build the city up and to build the temple up, that would encourage many of these other Jews. Okay, now we have the temple again. Now we have the Freedom Tower again. Yes, it's not Solomon's temple anymore. Solomon's temple, that era of Solomon's temple, that era of the Jewish kings, that's over. It's over. This is a new era, and we got the new temple built, and now it's safe to come home. This is what Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah that they were faced, and this is what is recorded in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm going to play this clip. It's pretty long, but this will probably be the last clip. What else do we have here? Yeah, I guess that stuff can wait until Monday. But this is an overview of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's basically one book. But in the Bible, many Bibles have them separated as Ezra and Nehemiah. This is a book written about the time period within those 500 years between the decree of Cyrus and this story ends long before, centuries before the birth of Christ. But in those early years after the decree of Cyrus, in those early groups that go back to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. That's what the book of Ezra and Nehemiah talk about, and the obstacles that they face, many with the people that were already living there. Just like what's going on today, the conflict is the people that were already living there when the Zionists went back. And when the Zionists went back after the Babylonian exile, there were people already living there. Many of them were Jews or partial Jews who had intermarried and with other people, and they had been living there. And these are the conflicts that they go through, which are recorded in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Take a listen.
The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem, and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on 3 key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these three stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support. And then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the three parts. Let's back up and see how it fits together. So the story begins with a decree from Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he's moved by God to allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And the author says this fulfills a promise made by the prophet Jeremiah that the exiles would one day return to Jerusalem. Now, this fulfillment should trigger our hopes in the many other prophetic promises that exile was not the end of the story. We have hope for a future messianic king from the line of David. We have hope for a rebuilt temple where God's presence will dwell with his people. Hope for God's kingdom to come over all the nations and bring his blessing, just like he promised to Abraham. And so it's with all these hopes in mind that we read on into the story of Zerubbabel. His name means planted in Babylon. He represents the generation born in Babylonian captivity, and he leads a wave of Israelites returning to Jerusalem. After they settle there, they rebuild the altar for offering sacrifices, and later the temple itself. The foundation-laying ceremony, and then the temple's final dedication, these are key moments. The past stories of the tabernacle and temple's dedication should be in our minds. This is when the fiery cloud of God's presence is supposed to descend. He's dwelling with his people, and it doesn't happen. And so while some people are happy about this new temple, the elders who had seen the previous temple of Solomon, they cry out in grief.
Wow. This is a very important part. Okay, so the people that knew the era of Solomon's temple and knew the era of the kings of Egypt, even if they were young when they remember Solomon's temple, and then they're old now during the period of the Freedom Tower of Zerubbabel's temple. They're saying it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel the same. The presence of God is not here, is what they're saying. They identify the young people that were born in Babylon, the young people that had no they had no concept of what this world was. Many of you know what I'm talking about. Many of you remember this world. But the people that are born under the second temple, under Zerubbabel's temple, even though they'll look at the Freedom Tower and say, "Oh man, Freedom Tower is awesome. That's awesome. That what a majestic representation of our culture and our God that we can have something like this." And they still love it. They still think that it's awesome, but they don't have any concept of what it was like during the period of the Twin Towers. That's what's going on here. So let's listen to this again. So the presence, so that's what the temple is. The temple is about the presence of their God. And they don't have that same feeling after they build the second temple.
Fiery cloud of God's presence is supposed to descend. He's dwelling with his people, and it doesn't happen. And so while some people are happy about this new temple, the elders who had seen the previous temple of Solomon, they cry out in grief. It is nothing like their glorious past or their hopes for the future. And it's right here that we get the first story of opposition, and it's very odd. So the grandchildren of the Israelites who were not taken into exile, they had been living in Jerusalem all along.
These are the people that were not taken into exile, who had already been living there, who had already started intermarrying and marrying Gentiles. They didn't have any leadership. They were just, they're farming the land, leaving their lives. They weren't taken into exile.
The Israelites who were not taken into exile, they had been living in Jerusalem all along. They come to offer help with the temple rebuilding. And Zerubbabel refuses. He says, "You have no part in our temple." And this, of course, generates a conflict, which Zerubbabel overcomes, but it's very strange, because the prophets had envisioned that the tribes of Israel would all come together, along with all of the nations, to participate in the worship of the God of Israel when the kingdom finally comes. So this is an anticlimactic moment, to say the least. In the next section, we zoom forward about 60 years and we're introduced to Ezra. He's a leader among the exiled Israelites in Babylon. And he's a Torah scholar and a teacher. And so he gets appointed by Artaxerxes, king of Persia, to lead another wave of people back to Jerusalem. And Ezra wants to bring about spiritual and social renewal among the people. Our hopes are high. And again, we come to another anticlimactic moment in the story. Ezra learns that many of the exiled Israelites that had come back, they had married non-exiles who had been living around Jerusalem. Some of them were non-Israelites, and almost certainly some of them were. Ezra then appeals to the commands of the Torah, that Israel was supposed to be holy and separate from the ancient Canaanites.
Understand what the problem is here, is that they're intermarrying and they're marrying people that are not 100% Jews, that don't have 100% Jewish genealogy that dates back to the period before the Babylonian captivity. Some of them they're coming back from Babylon. They're marrying people that were already living there. Some of them are Jews. Some of them may be half Jews and half Gentiles. Some of them may be 100% Gentile. That Ezra has a problem with this intermarrying.
Israelites, and almost certainly some of them were. Ezra then appeals to the commands of the Torah, that Israel was supposed to be holy and separate from the ancient Canaanites. And he then says that the people living around Jerusalem are like the Canaanites. They're going to corrupt the exiles. So Ezra offers a prayer of repentance, and it's very heartfelt. But then he rallies all the leaders and enacts this divorce decree that says all these marriages should be annulled, the women and children sent away. And then the decree is only partially carried out. We're given a list of some of the men who divorced their wives. The story is very strange for a number of reasons. First of all, God never commanded Ezra to do any of this. It was the leaders of Jerusalem who led Ezra to make the decree.
Very important.
The contemporary prophet Malachi, he did say that the exiles should care about purity, but he also said that God was opposed to divorce. And so the mixed results of the decree, this all fits into this pattern of a strange concluding anticlimax. Which leads us to the next section about Nehemiah. He's an Israelite official serving in the Persian government, and when he hears about the ruined state of Jerusalem's walls, he prays and then gets permission from the Persian king Artaxerxes to go and rebuild the walls. The king even gives them an armed escort and all these resources. So after arriving in Jerusalem, he begins the building project, and he too faces opposition from the people who had already been living around Jerusalem. Once again, we face a tension in the story. The contemporary prophet Zechariah said that the new Jerusalem of God's kingdom would be a city without walls, that God's presence would surround it, that people from all nations would come and join the covenant people. But Nehemiah seems to operate with the opposite vision. He informs the people surrounding Jerusalem that they have no part in Jerusalem. And this, of course, provokes them to hostility. And so while
Listen to this. Listen to Nehemiah telling the people who live, think about the conflict that's going on there today. And that has been going on there for the past 70 years. Nehemiah tells the people who had already been living there when they come back from Babylon, from exile, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city, and this Zionist movement, that Nehemiah tells the people that had already been living there that you have no part in this. Some of them maybe partially Jewish and have, a partial Jewish ancestry because of mixed marriages. I mean, some of them, anyway, it'd be the parallels are slapping you in the face between the second Zionist movement and the Zionist movement of today. Nehemiah tells the people who have already been living there that you're not welcome.
Opposite vision. He informs the people surrounding Jerusalem that they have no part in Jerusalem. And this, of course, provokes them to hostility. And so while Nehemiah carries out his vision for the city with integrity and courage, they have to build the city with armed guards to protect them, we keep wondering, could this whole conflict have been handled differently? And this all leads to the conclusion of the book in two movements, first positive and then negative. Ezra and Nehemiah combine forces to bring about a spiritual renewal among the people. They gather all the exiles together for a
That's it from the beginning. Spiritual renewal was what it was all about. It wasn't only about the decree of Cyrus and the end of the exile to go back, rebuild the city, and to rebuild the temple. It's a spiritual renewal of this. Is what it's all about. That the whole exile, the reason that they went into exile and the Babylonian captivity is because of divine punishment. The northern 10 tribes, we've gone through this. It was all divine punishment. That they were being punished because of their disobedience, because they had gone off track and forgotten the decrees of their God, and they had sinned against God, and they were practicing witchcraft and setting up idols to other gods and all this stuff. And then that brings them into the Babylonian captivity as their punishment. And then after the Babylonian captivity, the entire reason to go back is spiritual renewal. The entire reason to rebuild the city and to rebuild the temple was spiritual renewal. So that was the mission from the beginning, from Zerubbabel to Ezra to Nehemiah. Spiritual renewal was the mission.
Bring about a spiritual renewal among the people. They gather all the exiles together for a festival. They read and teach the Torah to all the people for 7 days. And then they celebrate the ancient Feast of Tabernacles to remember God's faithfulness from the Exodus and the wilderness journeys. Then they offer a confession of their sins. They vow themselves to renew the covenant, follow all the commands of the Torah. And they finish with a great celebration over the temple, the walls of Jerusalem. And we're thinking this could be the turning point, but it's not. The book ends on a huge downer. Nehemiah tours around the city, and he finds that the people have not been fulfilling.
They haven't changed at all.
So Zerubbabel's work is undone as he finds the temple being neglected and staffed by all these unqualified people. He then discovers that Ezra's work is being compromised. He finds everyone violating the Torah. People are working on the Sabbath.
And we're going to get into this part right here when we get into the book of Malachi. Malachi is the final prophet, the Jewish prophet, and that's when the Jewish canon closes with Malachi, the final prophet, and he gets into detail of all this stuff. Even after we're supposed to have this spiritual renewal, they rededicate the temple. We're going to recommit ourselves to the covenant. We're going to obey the Torah. We're going to do everything right now. We're sorry about everything that we did that forced God to allow the Assyrians and the Babylonians to destroy us. But this is a new day. We're going to start off on it, and none of that happens. They don't change at all. They don't start anew and become a new people that are recommitted to their God and have this spiritual renewal. They don't do that at all. And we're going to get into that in the next podcast when we talk about the prophet Malachi. And we're going to go further into asking the question, are the Jews of the Bible, this period, are they the same Jews from today? And you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.